So let me turn to the professors in Beijing very, very quickly. And let me ask Professor Jia to begin and share with us your perspective of where the U.S. China relations are, especially in the aftermath, in light of the meeting between President Xi and President Biden in Bali, in Indonesia. So what is your assessment from the vantage point of Beijing? Professor Jia, thank you.
Okay, you want me to go ahead, right?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you. Because of time, I'm going to save on the niceties of words. I have planned to talk about 5 minutes and with 1 minute on each of these quick points. First is I'm a little more concerned about what you mean by coexistence, because in the U.S., coexistence used to be a Soviet phrase, and although here in China we talk about 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, but the Chinese language for that is 共处. That means, relate to each other rather than 共存, existence as in a material sense. So does your framing of coexistence point 2 imply an academic acceptance of the Soviet framing in the Cold War? That's something I want to learn more later on. The second quick point is that the US really is unrivaled. Sitting here in China, I don't quite see where this anxiety about the US status in the world comes from. We can go on about US military power, your dynamism in technological and business innovation, your share of the world economy, and your capacity to get others to follow you in a foreign policy preference, including towards China. Your main challenge is in domestic income distribution. Where does all this anxiety arise from? And it is also true that China has benefited enormously from input from the United States in its throughout its modern history. Different from the United States, which is self-sufficient by and large in energy and other essential inputs, China has to cultivate overseas markets for inputs and resources and the market for its final product. So this interdependence for China is natural and structural, including that with the US. And so that's probably my second point. So to continue on a little bit with the second point is that there is hardly any basis for China to even contemplate a Cold War 2.0 as a modality of relations with the US or the rest of the world, even though we do have some voices here in China that may lend support to that idea. A third quick point is that in the US, we do understand China now is a balance issue rather than a wedge issue between the Democratic and Republican parties. It's very difficult, if possible at all, for us to agree on a timetable or genealogy of what went wrong. But we must bear in mind that we have had 6 years of minimalized contacts between the functional agencies of the two governments. And then what can we propose next? I do propose that China should have the political fortitude to promote greenfield investment in the United States, regardless of the political rhetoric out of the United States. And then last but not least, what the US says to be invest, align, and compete is really the same as dual circulation here in China. Earlier, Tony Such made similar points, or beginning with Mark Wu made similar points. Each of us has our confidence, but we also need to bear in mind that countries, especially here in Southeast Asia, are already talking about having their own version of non-alignment in the face of U.S. China competition, real or imagined. I'm going to stop here. What I read, it's going to come out in the South China Morning Post. So if anyone wants to read the whole write-up, you can refer to it some other day. As always, the Q&A will be the most interesting part. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jia, for that opening remark. It's very good to have your frank opinion about the framing and other issues. Now let me turn to Professor Da. Same question, where do you think the relations are and what do you think the prospects of the relations are going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Huang. And first of all, let me thank Fairbank Center and also Institute for Asia for having me for this important dialogue. I think it's extremely important and smart to have Chinese perspective in this conference. I think it's important for us now to break the echo chambers, which I think is growing rapidly both in China and in the United States, which is very bad for the bilateral relations. And on the status of the current China-US relations, I think, of course, it's bad. And I think all the experts I met in China or in the US, I think are very pessimistic. And I think from Beijing's, watching that from Beijing, I think many American observers already believe that we are already in the second Cold War or a new Cold War, though it's not a mainstream view here in Beijing, but I believe many in the US believe we are already in the new Cold War. And of course, we had I will say a successful summit in Bali. Not because it can solving the problem or save the bilateral relations, but I do see a possibility of stabilizing our bilateral relations in the coming months and maybe next year. Next year, we don't have significant political agenda in both capitals. So probably we can do something, and the two leaders agreed to encourage senior level exchanges between the two governments, and of course, people to people exchanges. I think that's very important. But having said that, I have to admit that it's very fragile. It's very fragile effort because I don't know what the new Congress in the US will do next year. I think the incoming speaker, if he visit McCarthy, if he visit Taiwan, for instance, I think that will easily break the effort of stability. So I don't know, but I still hope, I still cross my fingers. I hope next year we can gradually stabilize the bilateral relations by increasing the exchanges of the officials and the average people. And in the mid and long term, I think two things are very extremely important. One, of course, is Taiwan. The other, I think, is technology and the decoupling. I think these two issues, Taiwan is the only issue that may drag us to a military conflict or even a war. And the technology and the decoupling issue will probably decide the end game of our competition, if we use this term competition. I think we need to gradually try to, if we have time, if we are fortunate enough, we need to try to reach a new equilibrium on those two issues, I mean, Taiwan and technology, and to explore the ceasefire line. Where should we stop? I mean, the US and China, where should we stop? For instance, small yard, high fence, it's okay that US have a small yard, but I think very importantly, first, the yard should be as small as possible. Second, the boundary should be clear. And the third, we need to keep the fence stable. We cannot move the fence, every month, every year, every day. It will create a dramatic, huge sense of uncertainty to the two countries, particularly to the community of business. So that will create big trouble for us. So I hope we can first reach some short-term stability next year. And if we are so lucky, maybe we can try to explore midterm and long-term coexistence. But I'm still very pessimistic. I'm very cautious. I don't know if all that will happen. Okay, I'll stop here. And like Professor Zhao, I look forward for conversations and the Q&As.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhao. Let me sort of go back to a very interesting observation that Professor Zhao made about Cold War II vis-a-vis Cold War I. One could argue that the reason, well, so 10 years ago, if we would have a similar conference here at Harvard, it would be cooperation between China and the United States, right? So I think one key issue is relative to where we were 10 years ago and 15 years ago, the state of relationship between US and China is extremely, first of all, the direction was unexpected. Secondly, relative to the high level of cooperations at all levels of the society and the government, students and scholars, intellectuals and government officials, business investments in both countries. I mean, Soviet Union and US never had that level of cooperation. It was kind of taken for granted that the two nuclear powers had a tense relationship with each other. So the minimum that the two countries could do was to maintain peace, right? So one could argue relative to where we were and relative to what we expected the relationship to evolve, we're in a very bad place today and in an unexpected place today. So whether or not Cold War II is a right framing, it does describe the anxiety on the part of many sections of American society because the relationship was moving in such a positive direction before. So I wonder if Professor Zhao, if you could elaborate on this point that that coexistence is a too negative term. If that's not the right factual description, what would be your description of the current relationship?
我的英文永远都是跟不上的。So we also always have a problem with English language. I take issue with that framing because too often here in China, we're not as attentive to the nuances. But I don't have a catchy vocabulary to describe the difference between, what I observed to be the U.S. China relations today and that between Russia, Soviet Union and the United States. But it is a huge disappointment, and both China and the United States must deeply reflect how and why, even during the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States could collaborate, or allow their scientists to collaborate to deliver vaccines for children. Whereas this time around with COVID, we're not cooperating, literally. If such a bad pandemic is actually preventing, and then I often, raise this issue, although it's passé, Wuxi Biologics that supplied ingredients for AstraZeneca, the COVID vaccine, came under sanctions by the United States. There are lots of things that make us feel, and these sort of little details add up among the professionals. A lot of times with these workshops, we listen to diplomats, we try to be politically correct, and some of the academics echo, try to do the so-called right sentiment, go with the sentiments. But I must say, the shape of the relationship, if you think about, the contrast that these two capable countries are not cooperating even on medicine. And then there is talk about biotechnology being the next round of US sanctions following semiconductors. And here in China, frankly speaking, many industries and hospitals, whatnot, they are making preparation just for that to arrive. What are we really doing ourselves, Cold War or not. So that's why I really take issue with the notion of coexistence.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. The Soviet Union and U.S. collaborated on vaccine. In many ways, there is a de facto collaboration between China and the U.S. Right? One of the scientists at Moderna played a key role in research on the Moderna vaccine. Shanghai Fuxing acquired the distribution rights of the Pfizer vaccine in China. So there's not a shortage of human capital collaboration, and more spontaneous, actually, more organic, rather than sort of coming from the government. But it is really a political decision, right, to kind of not allow that collaboration to go forward. So it was not lack of fundamentals, it was really lack of political will, political willingness. So we have to address that issue, right? So you described the problems very accurately, but what is what is your view of what is causing this lack of collaboration on the basis of very good fundamentals and the foundations that the two countries have laid out for the past 40 years, right? That's totally unexpected. Sorry, I didn't ask a question. Yeah, so,
yeah, I know. Yeah, there's a long stories to that, but instead of agonizing over what caused that, I think both of us need to self-reflect. After SARS here in China, our public health system, the Chinese Center for Disease Control, benefited from seamless collaboration with the United States. And that collaboration, began at the national level, went down to the provincial and city levels. And that spirit of cooperation, even some of the programs need to need to be restarted. And frankly speaking, the Chinese side needs to, this time around, it needs to pay up for these kind of activities, including for the work by Americans here in China. And then the sensitivities for these legislations over sharing of data, both of our countries have come up with legislation that are quite restrictive, but then in their implementation or later on, we need to create the kind of legal and other environment by listening to the scientists, by listening to the people who work in the field of epidemiology or whatnot, and rather than beginning with everything saying, well, this is going to be competition, this is going to be one over the other in the aggregate or abstract nation state sense.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. Let me turn.
Can I add a few words? Yes.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you about the your summary of the reason. I think we are intellectuals always feel nostalgic to the old good days. But I think we should not overemphasize on the political. For instance, the leaders factor. Let's if the U.S. have a different president, or if China is another different leader, we will have a different China-U.S. relation. I think it plays a role, of course, but I think generally speaking, there is a macro explanation. That is, we are passing the golden age of the globalization. I think the China-U.S. collaborate very well in globalized world, and the two countries benefit from that a lot. But I think obviously, I think it's more obvious in the U.S. and in developed world. There are some people suffered from that globalization. So we are securitize our economic relations. Not only between China and the U.S. I think the whole world is securitizing their economic relationship. China, U.S., China, Japan, China, India, for instance, and even I think between the U.S. and the EU, they are talking about subsidy. The industrial policy. I think there is also a sense of securitization no TTP, no TTIP. I think that's a big trend. I miss the old collaborative time, but I have to say we are in a new era, which I am not very. I do not enjoy it very well.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right about the consequences of globalization driving social divisions in the United States. But globalization is also a global phenomenon, and so it is not just between China and the U.S. And a lot of the domestic issues in the U.S. are driven by globalization, but also driven by the lack of social protection and those issues that have absolutely nothing to do with China. And it is unfortunate that politicians in the United States are framing everything as rooted in globalization as a whole, and in particular globalization with China. I absolutely agree with you that rhetoric is factually debatable and not correct. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that globalization with China has lowered the prices in the United States, has improved the standard of living. So it is unfortunate that the issue now is such a hot button issue that people are not willing to defend globalization with China. But let me ask Professor Da a different question. You mentioned Taiwan in your opening remarks. It would be great if you can share with us sort of China's view of Taiwan issue. And there's a kind of a debate about who is moving the status quo, right? So in the US, there's a belief that China is moving the status quo on Taiwan. And in China, there's a belief that the US is changing the status quo. And if you could share with us the view from China, how US is moving and changing the status quo, what is the foundation of that particular point of view? And then maybe we can have a better understanding of the Chinese perspective.
Yes, of course. Yeah. First of all, I really don't want to have finger pointing to each other who moved the envelope. But it's true. What you described. Both capitals blame the other side for changing the status quo because we don't have a common definition of the status quo. But from China's perspective, we criticize the U.S. because we think the U.S. is hollowing out its one China policy. The U.S. has its long-time one China policy, though China don't agree with that, but we know that you have one China policy. And for instance, in that one China policy, the U.S. had many restrictions on the high-level exchanges between the U.S. and the island. But obviously, the executive and also particularly legislative branch tried to break that or remove those restriction. And I think Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit is a good example of that. So there are many other cases. I don't want to, for sake of time, but I think from China's perspective, the U.S. is hollowing out the one China policy, which caused a problem on Taiwan issue and turns it into very dangerous. But of course, I know that U.S. also criticized China for that. So I think probably the most important thing is not to find out who make the first step, but how to stop. I think this is probably the more meaningful issue that we should answer.
Yeah. Okay, so let's avoid discussing original thing. And but I think it is kind of important, right? To pin down the causes and I think when the formula was devised, one China policy and restrictions on high level visits and the sales of weapons to Taiwan, when that formula was devised, Taiwan was in a very different place politically, right? And it was the later years of authoritarian regime. But today, Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. So there's an added complexity to the relationship. And the U.S., I'm not defending the policy, but the U.S. sometimes has a very ideological approach to foreign policy. So in that sense, you could argue that the U.S. has moved the needle because the ideological component that was not there, now it is there in the consideration. And I worry about Speaker McCarthy. First of all, I worry about him becoming speaker, but secondly, I worry about him going to Taiwan, and the goodwill that was established in Bali may disappear overnight because of that. It's really unfortunate that the issue has been elevated ideologically to this level. So let me open up the Q&A, right? And we have about 17 minutes and 20 minutes. So there's a microphone there.
Go ahead. There's a microphone. You can go to the microphone.
Yeah.
I'll just announce again, please just queue behind the microphone in the middle, and for anyone asking a question, please identify yourself by your name and your affiliation. Thank you.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, or Yiming, teacher at Boston University. It's very good to see Professor Zha and Professor Da here, and thanks for sharing your wisdom. I think the Chinese Professor Zha in particular was leading the very complicated discussion on U.S.-Japan relationship in the early 2000s, 2003 to 2006, and your team's efforts really made a difference in stabilizing and managing the relationship. Oh, okay, sorry. So, but my question is. I think when we talk about U.S.-China relations, Soviet Union, Russia is really looming large. So I wonder the Chinese leadership managed to avoid the Soviet fate, right? Now, do you think what's the strategic thinking and how likely that China can avoid the Russia fate today? So, is my question clear? Okay. So, so the Soviet Union. Yeah.
So let's keep it short because yeah.
Soviet global aspiration and norms are very similar to China's, and then Russia's, and they couldn't coexist in the current era with U.S.-led based order, and now looks like Soviet is on a trajectory that's even worse than before. Soviet. So I wonder whether there are serious discussions within China to think about how China could avoid the direct clash with the U.S. proposition or the Russia's current state.
I see. I think to answer your question rather quickly, there's, I don't think my Chinese colleagues agree with me all the time, but that's fine. Chinese foreign policy, including that toward the United States, or at least the public projection of it, has gone through a learning curve. There was a, phase of what's called wolf warrior diplomacy, and that was celebrated, but we have turned the page on that. And one specifics of avoiding this direct conflict, confrontation with the United States. Taiwan is a special case in relation to the Pelosi visit. But when you look at the reactions to the Biden's announcements on chips, we basically stay quiet. And instead, we have actually tried, the government has actually, I support that personally, try to discipline those Chinese companies that were designated to develop the chip industry. In other words, you ask more about yourself rather than blaming the US. And that's one way to avoid conflict.
Okay. So maybe next question.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. So, good evening. My name is Koi. I'm just an engineer. So I'm not socialist, I'm not in the liberal arts study. My question is, China have a lot of history. Every time you claim like 1,000 years of history, civilization. So American short history. So we have a lot of different culture, but why we use this civilized idea, make a proposal, focus on both of our country interested, both of our people interested, like 3 issues: environmental issue, pandemic issue, corruption. Those are issues without border. We don't have divided the border. We don't have to be focused on whatever the South China Sea and China's line. There's no border. This is our common issue. Why, from your point of view, can you propose some of the solution to help to solve those 3 very important issues? So I'd like to hear from you.
Okay. 3 big issues, yeah. Professor Da, maybe we can start with you. Yeah.
Okay, I agree that those are important issues, and the list we can also even add other elements, particularly those transnational threat to all the human being. But I don't know how to answer this question. But I think unfortunately we do not live in a vacuum. And the geopolitics, I think, plays a, it's in our mind. I mean, in all the leaders' mind, in the experts' mind. So so those transnational issues, those important issues are always being influenced by bilateral or geopolitical or ideological issues. Yeah, I don't know how to answer, but I will say this is the reality of our life. We are human beings. We are not God, so we are not perfect. I don't know if maybe Professor Zhao have a better answer, I guess.
Okay, we're not God. That settles the. Yes, next, please keep your questions short. Yeah, observation shorter.
You had said the main issue between U.S. and China were technology and Taiwan. What is China's position on the U.S. position on Hong Kong? And is there any population in China that thinks that the U.S. should be involved in the Hong Kong issue?
Okay.
There are many aspects about the Hong Kong issue or the Taiwan issue, what else? I think the basic difference, going back to what I said about the 共处,共存, or the English notion of coexistence and your tradition of international studies in assigning country ownership, is that for China, it's territorial, it's territory-based. We are not, as let's say, as Huang Yasheng just said, ideology or theory-based. Democracy is important, but democracy in America is none of China's business. Americans pay their own tax, they pay their own, they sort out their own issues. If they cannot sort out their own issues, we here in China have no obligation whatsoever to venture out and offer or to pretend even say we had a better solution. Too bad, as I said, here in China, we also have had that string of rhetoric that supposedly project a uniquely Chinese solution to the world's problems. But here in China, we are way more modest. Even frankly speaking, here we're called Neidi, the mainland, and Hong Kong. The many of the Hong Kong's problems in the mainland do not have a solution. You have to sometimes take measures what we ourselves may call corrective, and that may not be to the liking of the Hong Kong, some of the population in Hong Kong, but it's a, if I use a Daoist phrase, we're not perfect. If one party takes the position that somehow it can assign itself to adjudicate all the problems in the rest of the world, then you better stay the course till the end. If you don't, you don't want me to a longer list, right? And so it's okay. Let me stop there. Yeah, please.
Maybe let us imagine. I think all the countries have human rights issues, human rights problems. How about China sanction the U.S. For gun violence? How about China sanction the U.S. after the Capitol Hill riots? What will American people view that? I think we should put our feet in the other side's shoes. Criticism, I think, on human rights is welcomed here, but sanction and other, those issues that Professor Zhang mentioned, I think it's not welcomed here.
I think that's actually an interesting point of view, right? So if U.S. can criticize China on human rights, China has as legitimate right to criticize the U.S. But that does mean that human rights are a legitimate issue in bilateral relations and bilateral conversations, right? So that's, which is kind of the U.S. position all along. But I think we ought to acknowledge that. Next one.
Thank you for this fascinating conversation. I want to go back to the question of how we're framing this and the questions raised about coexistence. And I just wanted to ask you to quickly comment on some other potential frames. So one is kind of FDR's idea of having multiple policemen. And then the second would be kind of the Chinese phrase, 争霸,争雄, which is a competition for power in a sense, but without a fundamental disagreement in ideology and an acceptance of a unipolar world order. And then the third would be kind of a Maoist idea of China standing with the third world. So what do you think about these other framings and how might they allow us to think about coexistence in a different way?
What's the second one again?
The second one?
Yeah.
Still, so fighting for who's the hegemon or the xiong, like
head.
Like
maybe we can keep communicating.
He's the hegemon.
So there's a language session going on there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So the general question is: are there other ways to frame the relationship other than the ones that have been laid out? I thought we went through that issue before. Yeah, so, okay, so maybe we turn to the next question.
Good morning. Good morning, my name is Mario Artaza, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. My question is the following. We tend to concentrate very much on competition or coexistence in terms of trade or in politics, but we leave out sometimes something very relevant, which is the defense, the strategic, the military side. What are your thoughts with regards to how we can further coexistence when there are partners in the Pacific moving forward with AUKUS, with the Quad, engaging countries, for example, by China in terms of military alignment with Iran, with Russia and exercises? How can we move forward in gaining trust when we have those lines? Thank you very much.
Trust. Right?
The only purpose of giving Australia the California class nuclear-based submarine is to kill Chinese nuclear submarines before they venture out of the so-called first island chain. That's no secret. And it's Australia's decision to make whether or not it would invest in doing that much. But I'm less, let's say, worried about these things because, let's be frank, military industrial complexes exist in all countries, and that fear-driven investment in new technologies will someday be translated into civilian use. But then the key point here is communications, frank and honest deadlines, like we draw very clearly towards our neighbors, Korea, Japan, Australia, Southeast Asia. What you can do, what you cannot do. That there's no ignore. I wouldn't say ignore. We leave aside all this talk about order, about legitimacy, or even history. There are boundaries. And so long as we are honest with each other, we're open with each other about the boundaries, then we avoid misjudgments about each other's determinations. And then that's a way to avoid conflict. But I'm not really that negative about this, what you said about security, even joint exercise, whatnot. The military industrial complex is a way of life in all countries.
Professor Zhang?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, so we have two more. Maybe we can gather the two questions together and end the session. Jason?
Thank you for being here. My name is Jason Xu. I'm a former legislator in Taiwan and a current senior fellow at Ash Center. So my question is following. So in terms of deterrence strategy, U.S.'s export control aiming at cripple Chinese ability to get advanced microchips. But if U.S. completely cut off China's chip supply, would China be back to the corner and then attempt to launch attack on Taiwan for the matter of the semiconductor supply? And also, a few months ago, there is a Chinese scholar, Chen Wenling, mentioned that in order to grab microchips and TSMC, China must invade Taiwan. What is that a prevalent view from the Chinese academic or think tank world? Just want to comment on those. Thank you very much.
So two professors, let me have the last question and then we answer both of them together. Yes, the last one.
Hi, Professor Dai and Professor Zhang. I'm Harry Wang. I'm former sportsman scholar back to Beijing and right now a student at Harvard Kennedy School. It's very nice to meet you two professors again. My question is actually relatively lightweight. The COVID-19 pandemic has prevented many of the critical human-to-human communications for the past few years. After the COVID-19 lockdowns and impacts finally wear off, what do you think are the first priorities that can boost the current U.S. relations that can happen? Yes, thank you very much.
Professors?
Okay, James, I think you're really underestimating the wisdom of people here on the mainland when you say, TSMC is worth launching an attack. Yes, you are right. Chen Wenling did say that much. But what you did not notice is how quickly and how thoroughly what she said was denounced. And, this is one of the problems for us here to observe America too. We only pay attention to what's written and what's said. We fail to pay attention to what's not so loudly said or what's not transcribed into a different language, a language we're familiar with. The semiconductor industry in China has made great strides in development, given its low base. And we have had our share of problems, including what was said earlier in terms of corruption. The state of affairs today, or the vulnerability in the supply chain, is the answer has to come from within. The U.S. can identify that. Even without identification, we should have done better. No matter how you criticize it, made in China 2035 or what was said, indigenous innovation, we have had some 30, 40 years to do a better job on semiconductors and on other lines of industry, including biotech. So what do? Attack Taiwan for that? No, you really underestimate us. We will work. And if you go back, you think about the so-called U.S. choking, right? You remember Congressman Virginia Woolf, right? He had this legislation back in the 90s about a space program. We did it. We'll do it again. No doubt. It's a matter of time. We have to determine, we don't have to go to Taiwan to snatch anything. Come on, right? Now, with regard to the second question about what can happen between China and the US, I think rather immediately we need to open direct flights between the countries. If China and Israel, China and Singapore, China and Korea, between China and the US, we need to open reopen the travel for the people to move between the countries. And doing that is based on the faith that the majority of the population on both sides, they really can make judgment on themselves, by themselves, about the other society, rather than assuming that every American coming to China is either a Pelosi follower or some whatever characterization, or every Chinese going to the US must belong to any of those camps. Let the people feel it out by themselves.
I agree with everything Professor Jia said. I think semiconductor industry, that's a very long production and supply chain, and no country, no region, no company can monopolize the whole thing. And obviously, this is a common sense. So we should not exaggerate any country or any region's capability or role in that supply chain. Occupying Taiwan is useless for produce semiconductor chips, I think, or occupy any other places. I don't think we can. I was in the same conference with Chairman Ling. We laugh at her, to be honest. So don't exaggerate Taiwan's role, and we are not so stupid on the mainland. On the second question, I think besides those flights, obviously that's urgent, badly needed. I think with that flights, and then I think what we need to do is to make sure that people from the academia and from business community can travel safely with confidence. I think past three years or maybe 4 years, I think harmed the confidence of people from academic community and business community to travel. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Chinese scholar don't dare to travel to the US. US scholar has concern travel to China. I think that must be end. And I think the two governments can help that happen. Yeah, that's my suggestion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Jia and Professor Da, for sharing with us your perspectives, your points of views, and I really appreciate, and I think the audience here, as well as on Zoom, we all appreciate how direct, how frank, and how specific you are in your discussions and the remarks. So on behalf of the organizers of the conference, on behalf of the audience, let me applaud your participation in this conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will just add that for the professors who are on the screen, we want to thank you again so much. I will tell you that at 8 a.m. in the morning, we have a jam-packed room here. So they came out to hear you. Everyone in this room is listening with ears wide open, and we have hundreds more people online. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing what might be some glimmers of hope So very grateful for that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce, we're going to have a break for about 5 to 10 minutes, and let's reconvene here at 9:30. Thanks so much.